Today we're learning about solving quadratic equations by factoring. So we factored, now we're going to solve equations by factoring. So I know I've got this when I can solve quadratic equations by factoring, solve equations with degree greater than 2 by factoring, find the x-intercepts of the graph of a quadratic equation in 2 variables, and solve quadratic equations by graphing. So the key vocabulary is quadratic equation, standard form, quadratic equation, and 2 variables. So quadratic equations can be written in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a, b, and c are real numbers, and a does not equal 0. The zero factor property, if a and b are real numbers and a times b equals 0, then either a equals 0 or b equals 0. So the x-intercept of a quadratic equation is where y equals 0. Okay, so the x-intercept is where y equals 0, and that is what you would say would be the solution of a quadratic equation. Now, all you have to do to solve this is this problem, it's already factored, right? So once you factor it, you just set each individual factor equal to 0 separately and solve for x. So the answers to this are -7 and 2. So the solution set you would write as -7 and 2. And the meaning of that is if you were to draw this, if you were to graph this equation, that it would hit the y-intercept, the x-intercept, I'm sorry, the x-intercept at -7 and 2. One B, same thing, you're going to set each factor to 0. So you have to set this factor to 0 and the 3x plus 2 equal to 0. So x equals 0, or it also is a solution at x equals -2/3. So you would say the solution set for this is -2/3 and 0. All right, you try this one. Go ahead and pause. And you should have gotten the answer is +2/5 and 0. So to solve polynomial equations by factoring, you factor it. Basically, you write the equation in standard form so that one side of the equation equals 0. Standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So you're going to write the terms in order from the highest exponent to the lowest. Then factor the quadratic equation completely. Set each of those factors equal to 0. Solve the equations and check them. So we need to factor 2x squared minus 5x minus 88. So you think, okay, what times what is 2x squared? 2x times x. What times what is 88? 11 and 8. Okay, so if I did this, let's see if that would work. That would give me 11x, -16x, which would give me that -5x in the middle that I need. So once I factor it, I take each of those factors and set them equal to 0. So 2x plus 11 equals 0, and x minus 8 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 11 from both sides and divide the 2. So one of my answers is -11/2. And I would add 8 to both sides and get x equals 8. So the solution set for this is -11/2 and a +8. Two B says x cubed equals 16x. The very first thing that you have to do is set one side of the equation equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract that 16x. Now, I need to pull out any greatest common factors, which they both have x in common. So if I took that out, I'd be left with x squared minus 16. Now, I see that this is a difference of squares, so I'm going to say x times x, 4 times 4, I needed a plus and a minus. And I'm going to set each of those factors separately equal to 0 and solve. So I get x equals 0, x equals -4, and x equals +4. So I can say my solution set is -4, 0, and 4. Now this would not be a quadratic equation, right? Because it has x cubed. It would be a cubic solution. Solve 4x times 8x plus 9 equals 5. All right, so I have a hint here. So let's see what that says. It says distribute and set one side equal to 0 before factoring. Okay, so you have to set one side equal to 0, right? I'm going to distribute this 4x. So I'm going to have 32x squared plus 36x. Now I need to subtract that 5 from the other side. Okay, now go ahead and you work it out. And this is what you should have gotten. Okay, number 3, find the solutions, which are the x-intercepts of the graph y equals x squared plus 2x minus 3. So remember that to find the x-intercepts, you have to replace the y with 0 and solve for x, because the x-intercepts are where y equals 0. So I'm going to replace that. Now I'm going to factor. Okay, so I've got what times what is x squared, x times x. What times what is 3? That would give me a +2. So that would be a +3 and a -1. So if I set those equal to 0, I would get x equals -3 and add 1 to both sides, and I would get x equals 1. So my x-intercepts would be -3, 0, and 1, 0, because they're asking for the x-intercepts. So it would look like this if I graphed it, and you can see that it's hitting at -3 and at +1. Three B, find the solutions of x-intercepts of the graph y equals x cubed minus x squared minus 4x plus 4. Okay, so remember we have to set the y equal to 0. So I'm going to say 0 equals x cubed minus x squared minus 4x plus 4. Now we are dealing with a quadrinomial, right? So how do we solve a quadrinomial? You break it in half. And you factor out, what terms could I factor out here? An x squared, and I'd be left with x minus 1. In the second half, I can factor out a -4, and I'd be left with x minus 1. So I'm going to take what they have in common, the x minus 1, and what they don't, the x squared minus 4. Now, x squared minus 4 is still a difference of squares, so I can actually factor that again to x times x, 2 times 2, a plus and a minus. That would give me this. So if I set each of those factors equal to 0, I would get x equals 1, -2, and a +2. So my graph would look like that. And my x-intercepts of the graph are at 2, -2, and 1. All right, here's one for you to do, so go ahead and try. Your graph would look like that, which means that your x-intercepts are at 1 and -1. All right, here's some extra practice for you to do, so go ahead and pause the video. And your answers are right here. All right, I know I've got this when I can solve quadratic equations by factoring, solve equations with a degree higher than 2 by factoring, which are those cubic graphs that we saw. Find the x-intercepts of the graph of a quadratic equation in 2 variables and solve quadratic equations by graphing. But do you really understand? So how would you use the zero factor property to solve the equation x squared minus 2x minus 15? You would first factor the left side of the equation, then set each factor equal to 0 and solve. What are the first two steps? First two steps in solving 2x cubed equals 8x. You would have to subtract 8x from both sides and then factor out the GCF, which would be 2x. How can you find the x-intercepts of the graph of a quadratic equation, such as x squared plus 7x plus 10 equals 0 without graphing? You solve the equation using the zero factor property, which is setting those factors equal to 0. The solutions of the equation are the x-coordinates of the x-intercepts of the graph.